I'm Catherine Arndt, the Chief of the VLGA Connect Studio. Welcome to today's episode, brought to you by the VLGA, your counsellor support network and the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion for Children's Week on children's participation. My name is Chris Eddy, and it's my pleasure to be your host today. As we have our participants join us, I'll introduce you to our panelists in just a moment. But firstly, I would like to acknowledge on behalf of the VLGA the traditional owners of country throughout Victoria and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to the traditional owners, their elders past, present and future, and to their cultures. I'd like to take a moment to tell you a little bit about the VLGA and what it does. It supports councils and councillors to deliver great outcomes for local communities through high performance and good governance. The VLGA is member-run and non-partisan and aims to provide practical advice, direct support, training, professional development, events, networks and resources to members and to carry out research, policy analysis and advocacy on behalf of local councils. It also offers members the opportunity to realise their true leadership potential and to increase their impact. Also today, we'd like to tell you about the Child-Friendly Cities and Communities movement, which is working to bring individuals, organisations and communities together to collectively uphold and individually practice the principles of the Victorian Child-Friendly Cities and Communities Charter, and it's underpinned by the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. As a collective, the movement works alongside children to empower them to act as active and engaged citizens and to share their unique perspective with their communities. This year, the Children's Week theme is Children Have the Right to Relax, Play and Take Part in Activities They Enjoy. And this will be the foundation of today's discussion. How can local government ensure that we ensure children's participation and engagement in the decision-making process? And there's some more information there for you on screen about the Charter. Throughout the course of the session today, please feel free to add your questions for our presenters into the Q&A box, and we'll endeavour to get to them throughout the session or in the Q&A component that comes toward the end if time allows. The chat function is also open for any commentary or discussion during the course of the panel. Please note this webinar is being recorded and it will be made available to all those who have registered and VLGA members, I assume, in the coming days. All right, having gotten all of that out of the way, let's get started with some discussion. And I would like to introduce today's panellists. We're delighted to have with us Meena Singh, the Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People. Meena is a Yorta Yorta and Indian woman born and living on the land of the Kulin Nations. She combines her lived experience with professional expertise and is passionate about understanding individual and community identity and experiences to promote inclusion. Looking forward to chatting with Meena in just a moment. We also have Lauren Thomas, Senior Project Lead for Child and Youth Participation and Engagement at the Australian Childhood Foundation. Lauren was awarded a fellowship with the Creswick Foundation researching international approaches to children's rights for vulnerable children. And over the past 20 years, she's worked with vulnerable and traumatised children, young people and their network of relationships. And finally, Natalia Krishak, a practicing architect at Hayball and the founder of Cities for Play. Natalia specialises in the design of child-oriented environments. Her areas of research focus on child-friendly cities and how the built environment can contribute to the health and well-being of children. In 2019, Natalia was awarded a Churchill Fellowship exploring best practice for designing child-friendly, high-density neighbourhoods in Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan, Canada and the UK. How's that for a high-powered panel to talk on our topic today about children's participation as part of Children's Week? And there you all are on the screen. Lovely to have you here, and let's get into some discussion. We're going to break the discussion today into the four theme areas, starting with participation. And Meena, if I can come to you first, perhaps in your role, can you give us a brief overview of the work that the Commission does, firstly?
Hello, and I'm so sorry I arrived a little bit late. Before I speak, I would like to just acknowledge the traditional lands we're all gathering from. I'm currently on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, on Naarm in Melbourne. Pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge that wherever we are on land over which sovereignty was never ceded. So I'm the Victorian Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People, and so I work with Principal Commissioner Leanna Buchanan at the Commission for Children and Young People. And our work, just a quick overview, is probably divided into 3 areas, but we're very much focused on vulnerable or children who are vulnerable in places such as out-of-home care and child protection, and also youth justice. So we have a monitoring and oversight role. We see what's happening to kids in those spaces. It's a little bit easier with youth justice. On any given day in Victoria, it's about 100 kids who are in youth justice detention centres. Most of those kids are on remand, not serving a sentence. But for out-of-home care, there's around 9,000 children and young people who are in out-of-home care. So it makes keeping an eye on all of their circumstances really tricky. We also look at, we do inquiries, and probably that's something that a lot of people know us for, particularly our systemic inquiries. So part of our work is to provide advice to government, to decision makers about how they do their work in spaces of out-of-home care, youth justice. So to do that, we often do systemic inquiries, which deep dives into what's happening in those systems, and we usually focus them on specific thematic issues. So we're about to finalise our inquiry into educational experiences of children and young people in out-of-home care. So that'll be out in November. And then another part of our inquiries is sadly the work that we do around what happens to children, what's happened in the lives of children who have passed away and they've been in out-of-home care or engaged in child protection. And again, we do those reviews to try and improve the systems and make sure these things don't happen to other kids as well. And then the last bit is regulation, but I won't deep dive into that.
Okay. Important work, all of that, Mina. In light of the theme of participation, we hear about, it's important to have children participate in the matters that impact them. What does that mean for you?
Yeah, so our work is very much guided by one of the features of the Victorian Child-Friendly Cities Charter, Article 12 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. That is for children and young people to be involved in the decisions that are made about them when they're able to give input. And what we found in our work is that children of most ages can tell us how they're feeling about a situation, or what they want in their life, or what they might not be liking in their life, what they'd like to see happen. Certainly the work that we do involves talking directly to children and young people in out-of-home care, in residential homes, in youth justice. For our education inquiry all around the state, we travelled and talking to children and young people about their experiences. There are so many decisions made about these children every single day that they have no knowledge of or no input into. And what we find in our work when we're advocating for children, perhaps for a single child and their circumstances, what we find is when that child is engaged in the decision making, when they're actually asked, what would you like to happen? Simple things as, where would you like to go to school? Who do you want to see visit? What sort of activities do you want to take part in? When they're asked those things, particularly for a child that's been through traumatic experiences, as pretty much all of the kids that we engage with have been through, when you give some semblance of power back to those children to be able to make a choice in their life, to be asked and have their opinion valued, it really puts so much positivity for the child to say, okay, I have some semblance of control over what's happening around me, or at the very least to tell them what's going to happen and involve them in that process. It makes such a significant difference to how children respond and understand. And I always say to people, it's exactly the same for us as adults. We don't like decisions being made without our input. It is exactly the same for children and young people, even more so because the kids that we see and deal with are particularly vulnerable and have been made particularly vulnerable by their experiences. But every kid and young person wants to have a say in what happens about them. It's so important.
Thanks, Mina. I'll come back to you shortly. I want to introduce Lauren into the conversation. Lauren Thomas, can you just briefly tell us about the work that you do and what does children's participation mean for you?
Thanks, Chris. I'm Lauren Thomas. I work for the Australian Childhood Foundation. We're a national not-for-profit. We work with children, young people and families, most often in the context of trauma, abuse and neglect. But also in the spaces of supporting parents and carers as well. So quite often we're working with vulnerable children, but not quite always. And in our work, we work in the space of participation as well, thinking about how to involve children and support their participation, and very much with a children's rights framework as well to think about that. So we're thinking about how do children get the opportunity to meaningfully participate in the decisions that are being made about them, in the decisions that impact their life, and considering from that perspective and thinking about it being a children's rights perspective. Something I always think a lot about is how, and I guess it runs maybe a little bit counter to the way society thinks about it, is that this is really a child's right. To participate is a child's right, and it's not a privilege that we are bestowing on children. And I think often we can fall into a trap maybe that adults think that this is something nice that we do for children. It's a nice thing for me to decide that I'm going to listen to children or set up a little project that gives children the opportunity to share their views. How lovely that we decided to listen to children. And I think it's really important that it's also the law in Victoria, but it's a really important consideration. And I'm really glad that the VLGA is encouraging councils to think differently about this. How can local government ensure that children have these opportunities and organise them? How can local government organise themselves to make this a part of the way that business is done? Because children really do deserve to be participating in all of these decisions in different ways. And so that's part of my work. In fact, my role is set up to facilitate projects to ensure that systems and services are designed to consider this. So that's a big part of my work.
Does your work intersect much with local government, particularly with councils, Lauren? And if so, what do you observe in this space?
Sometimes I am part of the VLGA, so I attend those meetings and I get to see some of the beautiful projects and pieces of work that happen on occasion. And I also do and deliver some training to different councils, to early childhood staff, or to different training calendars. I get to observe some of the different ways that people are trying to really wrestle with the ideas of what participation could or should look like. I also see that sometimes there are people that are still grappling with what the standards and principles might mean, and that sometimes there is a disconnect between what upper level management and staff who work with children thinking participation or voice looks like. So I think something that I think helps is when we start to think about it from a rights-based perspective. We know there's more than just letting the child have a say. There's more to it than just voice, because really for children to participate from a rights-based perspective, it's meaningfully embedded all the way through an organisation. I know there's lots more for us to talk about this, so I don't want to dominate the whole conversation right now, but I think really from management to policies, processes, your whole organisation needs to have been considering how does participation make an impact in the way that we work? How does it inform our processes? How does it guide our systems? And how are we ensuring that this has an impact? And it's far more than just the worker listened to a child on the floor today. So I think that's what I'm seeing. Would you like me to explain more of that, or shall we?
I think we'll come.
Into it?
Yeah, the answer is yes, but perhaps not just yet. We might come back to
All
that,
right.
Lauren. And I imagine some of the people in the audience are probably thinking about what you've just said, particularly about the role of senior leadership. And I know we've got a lot of people that are in lower levels of the organisation probably thinking, well, how do I do that? So maybe that's something we can come back and unpack a little bit if we have time. But I do want to bring in our last panelist, which is Natalia Krishak. Hi, Natalia. Can you tell us a bit about the work that you're doing and how this issue of children's participation being a right, not a privilege, resonates with you?
Thanks, Chris. I think, very much resonate with what Lauren and Mina have already said. My perspective is quite different. As you mentioned at the beginning, I'm an architect and an urban designer, so my focus is very much on the built environment. And something that has shocked me right from the beginning of my career is just how little voice children have when it comes to the built environment. I am constantly on panels and sort of decision-making forums when it comes to city design or building design, and there is hardly ever a voice of a child in the room.
Wow.
And when there is a voice of a child, it's usually extremely tokenistic, and it's not very genuine or long-term. So that to me was very, very shocking. And that's why I set up Cities for Play, which engages with kids. It advocates for the voice of kids in the design of our built environments, so that a child is sort of at the decision-making table as a decision maker, not just as a participant. And I think the word participation also for me, it's so much more than just participation. It's actually about co-creation. So it's about giving children that agency to not just be sort of there and as a tick the box sort of exercise, but to be genuine, to have that genuine agency to make decisions about the environments that they use, and having that power to actually be part of the discussion. I think, as Lauren said, we often think of engagement with kids as something very cute, something sort of nice to have, or isn't that going to be fun? But the reality is that 20% of our population is 14 or under. That's a big chunk of our population. And we need to take that seriously in terms of what this sort of huge chunk of our population is actually saying, asking for. And the more seriously we take it, the more genuine it becomes, and the more impact it can have in terms of the long-term effects of the lives of children, and far more beautiful, more sustainable, more livable cities and environments for everyone. So it's hugely passionate thing, and a big gap currently in the industry.
Congratulations, Natalia, on setting up Cities for Play. I wonder whether you obviously your own experience inspired you to go down this path, but has anybody else done anything similar in other jurisdictions that you're aware of?
Yeah, it's definitely growing interest. The idea of engaging with children in city design, city planning, building design is definitely becoming a huge growing interest. As I said before, it's often still a tick the box sort of exercise. So it's sort of when you might be designing a school or a play space, there might be a box saying, have you engaged with children, yes or no? But it's very rarely set up as a long-term genuine process, which allows children to have power and decision-making sort of agency within the process. So that's something that comes more to leadership and to the things that local councils are setting up to make sure that those processes are embedded in legislation and in the processes generally. So it's sort of it's increasing, but it's still not always done genuinely.
So we will come to leadership. That's one of the four themes we want to talk about, voice and representation of the others. But I suspect they're going to cross-pollinate as we move through the discussion today. Before we do move on with the theme, I wonder whether Mina or Lauren might have some examples of perhaps missed opportunities or where things have gone wrong because that participation of children at the onset of a project's development didn't occur. Has anything sort of resonated with you as you've heard Natalia talk about that?
I know I've been asked to be on sort of reference groups or advisory groups for pieces of research about children and young people, and have seen the words co-design and inclusion bandied about, only to kind of go into those spaces the very first meeting and realize that and see that children and young people's voices haven't been thought of in any way, shape or form, or how they're going to incorporate them through the process and the design. Something we've been doing that was set up during COVID was, for us, a youth advisory council, and that's developed into the our youth council that has children, young people with lived experience or passions for changing systems. And we've just been learning more and more about how you bring in children and young people as early as possible, as soon as, and not even for you to get the idea, but for them to generate the idea, for them to develop the what is. And just last week I was at a Aboriginal Justice Forum in Victoria, focused on children and young people. And the reality is, if you give children and young people the space to think and the room to design and have these big ideas, they will develop the responses and the answers to the issues that they're facing, and they will develop it with such clarity before anyone with a black hat thinking comes in and says, oh no, we couldn't possibly do that. And the solutions they will come up with are perfect, and so I think the things where it is where adults haven't been prepared to let go of power. That's where I've seen it not go well.
I might just remind the audience again about the Q&A function, because we would like to make sure that you get to ask questions of our panelists today, particularly now you understand where each of them is coming from in terms of their field of experience and expertise. So please pop those questions in the Q&A box, and we'll start to populate those through the discussion as we go. We might bring in the next theme of voice. As I said, this will all merge together, I think, by the time we get to the end. And Lauren, I might come to you for an explanation. I'm really interested to hear you talk about this Laura Lundy child participation model. What is that, and why is it so relevant?
Yeah, well, it kind of ties into what I was referring to before, actually, about it being, there needing to be more than just listening to a child's voice. So Laura Lundy's model, which is sort of famous now in participation circles and people who study children's rights. In 2007, Laura Lundy she's an academic from the University of Belfast, and she is also a lawyer, a human rights lawyer, and she wrote an article, and the article was titled "Voice is Not Enough." And she had been speaking to children, consulting with children, and noticed something about their experience of having given their opinions or views, sharing their views. And she noticed that often their experience of sharing their views wasn't necessarily equal to them having experienced their right to participate. So they'd shared their voice had been heard, but when she was trying to decide, have they experienced their right to participate, she realized voice wasn't enough. And so she wrote this article, and the article, she tried to go through the language of Article 12 from the United Nations Charter on the Rights of the Child. And she teased out this language from the Charter and broke it down into 4 parts. And she, in this model, which is now widely called the Lundy model, she broke it down into 4 parts, which she said, if organisations, or in the rights-based language, the legal language, duty bearers, are going to provide what's needed for children's right to participate to be achieved, there are 4 things that must be provided. And these are the 4. Space. So you must provide, as a council, as a school, as an educator, as a government, whatever role organisation you are in, you must provide a space for a child to participate, and that space must be safe. And so when you think about the child or the young person that you're working with, providing a space might be as simple as a physical environment, but it might actually also be a metaphorical space. You've got to think about creating space in terms of space for conversations. You've got to think about creating safe spaces. And when you're working with vulnerable children like Mina or I have spoken about, that there's lots of layers to that. And I think an added part of that too is that when you're working with vulnerable children, there's a tendency that I've noticed where sometimes we create barriers to their participation because we think we need to protect them more. And so we don't give them as many opportunities to participate because we're busy protecting them. So it's still their right to participate. We just need to think about how to create safe spaces for them a bit more. So the first area is space. The second area is voice. So in the Lundy model, what she was trying to articulate here is that children must be given opportunity to voice their views. There's two aspects actually within this. Children are very dependent on adults for the information to form a view. In order to form a view, you need information. Informed views, as we all know, require information. For you to have informed a view, to form a view, you needed information. If you want to vote on something, you need information. This is fairly topical, I think. You needed decent information. You needed good information to be provided to you, and for you to do due diligence with that information to weigh up your options. Children are heavily dependent on adults to provide that information. So when it comes to the Lundy model and we're thinking about voice, it's not enough just to say, what do you think, dear? We actually do also need to provide them with the information so that they're provided space and they're provided information, and then they're supported to be able to develop their view, and then they can share it. The second part of voice, though, is we're not doing this in an ableist way. We're not just saying only kids that can talk get to share their views. We've got to think broadly about that and in a supportive way. How do we let children share their views? So we're thinking multimodal. They can speak, but they could write. They could do this online. They might do it through a survey. They might have pictures. We also think about communication devices. We want to think about PECS devices or ACC devices. We want to think about having parents or carers or support workers there if that's what they need to be able to express their views. And if they're pre-verbal or non-verbal, making sure that we also maybe try and do consultations. I know this is something Natalia does work with young children as well, so she'll be able to talk to this as well, how she does this, but thinking about other ways to engage those and share those views, and thinking about how families can be involved as well. So voice is the second area. The third area in Lundy's model that she identified is audience. So children have a right, they need a space to share their view. They need to be able to form their view and share it, but we also need to provide them with an audience. They need an audience to be able to listen to that view. And in rights-based literature, so there's this United Nations Charter on the Rights of the Child with 54 different articles, right? And then there's also commentary. And so there's a commentary on Article 12, which says that this comment says that actually children are entitled that audience is as direct as possible to the decision-making power. Okay, so when we think about our council and our local government and our organisational body, we should actually be trying to provide direct pathways to the people at the top, the people that are making decisions about the information that's provided. So if you're going to be setting up a body or an advisory group with children and young people, we're not trying to say that they can just tell their worker on the ground, and the ground person can then tell the manager, and the manager can then tell their middle manager, and the middle manager can then tell, and hope that eventually it filters all the way up. We need to be able to provide structures where there is pathways directly, so that children and young people's information has an audience that is able to provide the next area, which is influence. And this is all what is required to make sure that children's rights are being realised. So the last area is influence. It's really important for children and young people to feel like when I say what my views are, it matters. It matters. And this is how we show them that it matters. We show them that it has had an impact. There's been influence when you open your mouth. And this is extremely important, all the more important for young people, children, young people who are vulnerable, who have been in vulnerable situations of abuse or neglect, or who are engaged in our systems, because they've had less potential opportunities of their voice mattering. In addition, when you think about children who maybe are vulnerable because they've been exposed to sexual abuse, or potentially maybe, we want children to learn from us that their voice will be believed, because then if they've had experiences where their voice has been heard and believed, they're more likely to speak up. So the more opportunities that we provide them of that, the less vulnerable they are. They're more likely to know that they can create and speak when they believe they're at risk. So there's layers to this.
Yes.
We decrease vulnerability in societies when we listen to children. So I think that's another layer to this, where participation is actually protective.
Lauren, thank you.
I could talk about this a long time.
I can tell, and that's an excellent summation. You're getting thumbs up, and I'm sure the audience has found that a really useful overview too of the Lundy model. While you were talking about spaces and safe spaces in particular, I was thinking, I bet Mina's got something to say here, particularly around cultural safety. Where was your mind going there, Mina?
I wish lots of people from our office were listening to you just talking them, because it just reaffirms a lot of the things that we try and put in place when we're engaging with children and young people. And one of the things about that influence piece is so important to see what happens with what you've said, because so often, and it happens not just with children and young people, but it happens with any group that's been actively marginalized and silenced, that they are asked, oh, how do we do better? And then they get nothing about what happens next. And so, one clear example for us that others might like to take is that when we do our monitoring visits of residential care homes, and we speak directly with children and young people in their homes, and we give them a gift card and thank them for their time, and say to them, we really value not only the time you give us, but your expertise, because you are living in this system. You have more expertise than anyone else of how this works. But also we write to them once we've collected all our information, and we tell them, you told us this is what we did with it. We wrote a letter to the minister and we told them about these things. So thank you so much for helping us make these spaces better. And, being able to, every now and then you'll get to have a follow-up with a kid that'll say, that was really cool. Thank you for telling us what you did with our stuff. But absolutely, the participation and the fullness of it is a proactive piece to keep children safe. And the child safe standards that have come out of Victoria's betrayal of trust inquiry, and then the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse. It's about creating safe spaces in every sense of the word for children and young people, so that if anything does happen that's bad to them, they know they will be listened to and heard, and what they say will be acted on. And there's all different types of safety. And the new child safe standards that came out in the middle of last year included a new standard that was around cultural safety. And for Aboriginal children and young people, cultural safety simply means that you're respected for your cultural identity. You're allowed to bring your cultural identity with you. It's not shamed. It's not questioned. This is who you are, and who you are is respected. And, if you look at any sort of definition or understanding of cultural safety, you can use it again to apply to just about any group that's been actively marginalized and silenced, because it's about listening. It's about respect. It's about meeting a person where they are as they come to you. And I always say, when I'm talking about cultural safety, is that each and every one of us knows what it means to feel unsafe. We know when we question ourselves. We know when we feel physically unsafe or psychologically unsafe. And so it's simply applying that to children and thinking about what are the different domains of safety. There's physical safety, there's cultural safety, there's emotional safety, there's all these different spaces. that really wrap around a child and say, you're okay here, we're going to hold you. If anything goes wrong, child safe standards also say we've got the processes to follow through on that as well.
Natalia, you run workshops, don't you? How does that issue of safety play into the way that you carry out those co-design processes?
Yeah, I think it's a really huge responsibility, engaging with children and making sure that it's not just that voice component, but it carries all the way through. It's a responsibility, and I think anyone engaging with children should take that responsibility very seriously. I very much resonated with what Mina and Lauren's beautiful sort of summary of the engagement, particularly around this idea of voice and how it often just stops at that point. I think in local councils, we see this very, very often, where there's a different team responsible for capturing voice, and there's a completely different decision-making team, and they often don't talk to one another at all. So the consultation team has ticked their box because they've consulted with the kids, and that's it. Their job is done, and that never gets transferred into any genuine decision making. So the requirement for, or the responsibility to take that voice all the way through is unbelievably important. And how we actually legislate that requirement, to me, is also really interesting. A good example of a country that does this very well is Wales, where they have a legislation where every local council needs to provide a place sufficiency report every 3 years. And that needs to be done through a genuine consultation process with children, where children are asked about their local neighbourhoods, where they like to hang out, where they like to play, where they like to be. And that needs to be reported and submitted to sort of the national government every 3 years. And that's published on every local government website. So you can see what children have said and how that has been transformed into decision making at the end of the day. So there's that responsibility for the voice to transfer into decisions at the end of the day, and the built environments that affect them. And because that's done every 3 years, you can sort of track the changes, you can track where that's coming from, and it's an ongoing committed process. And that's extremely important. So it's not just something that will disappear next year, it's a committed legislated requirement that you have to do forever. And that's obviously really important in terms of genuine collaboration and co-creation.
Great example. Can I ask you, when you're doing your workshops with children, how early is too early in terms of the age of children participation? How do you approach that?
Well, at preschool age, that's when children start to be able to form complex sort of symbolic ideas. And that's also the age when they're able to understand that a different person might have a different view or belief than they do. So that's sort of the traditional age when it's quite easy to engage with children in the traditional sense. There's absolutely no reason why you can't do it earlier, but the tactics that you would use would be very different. They would be engaging a lot more with the caregivers, but also very observation-based tactics. So a great example of that is one in Philadelphia, where an organization called Kaboom, they ran some observations of parents or caregivers with very, very young children and how they interact with their built environment. And what they found was that predominantly children below the age of 3 were cared for by their grandparents in this area, and they used public transport a lot. So what they decided to do is create a sort of an initiative called Playful Learning Landscapes, particularly around transport areas, where they put things like little book libraries and games and things that grandparents could interact with their babies with. So through observation, they were able to really unpack what the needs or opportunities might be for that age group. And we know that by the first year of a child's life, their brain has developed 90% of what it will develop. That's the first year. So it's sort of an enormous opportunity to engage with babies and toddlers and their caregivers for us to really meaningfully sort of create real impact on their lives. So there's no reason why we shouldn't engage earlier. It's just you have to understand the different tactics that you would use with different age groups. And that's extremely important.
So much we still want to get to, but I just wonder whether Lauren or Mina want to add something on that issue of the age of the child.
I would just say that my children certainly didn't learn that they couldn't participate or give me their opinions at any age. From a very young age, well before they could speak, they were sharing their opinions and telling me their views in other ways. And I think it's certainly incumbent on us as adults to make sure that we tune into them. In early childhood settings, we can easily understand children's views in some ways, because they can, when they cry, they teach us that they don't want us to do certain things or that they want certain things. So they turn away from bright lights. They don't want certain sounds, so they can show us their preferences. In assessments to do with risk and in family violence settings, we can learn about their experiences of risk and of violence by observing their behaviours, but also by asking their parents or caregivers about their experiences through family interviews. And in group settings, you can learn things through the parent or caregiver's narrative of the child's experience as well. There is other ways of being able to explore an infant's experience that are also insightful. There's different skills involved in that, and I think those kind of group interviews are part of that experience too. But there's both observation as well as interview skills that are part of that experience, I think. I don't know if you have things that you would want to add, but I think research certainly says, even before 12 months of age, there are definitely things that you can observe that are indicators of pre-verbal infants' preferences, and if we tune into them, we can understand children's views, should we want to.
Thanks, Lauren. I think Mina's suggesting that's a pretty adequate answer there. So, Mina, what I might do is come back to you, because there's a follow-up question to something you said earlier that's come from Amy at Marybeck Council in our audience. That comment you made about people in power perhaps being reluctant to give up the power in these processes. Amy wants to know, how do you encourage organisations and councils to lean into this and have the courage to share power with children and young people so that they can be involved in that decision making?
I think this is certainly something that's come, an understanding that I've gained through coming into this role as a commissioner and taking on a regulatory role with the Child Safe Standards. We're a co-regulator, and also the reportable conduct scheme. So while Child Safe Standards are the proactive work of how do we create child safe spaces, reportable conduct scheme is what do we do to respond to allegations of abuse. And I did not have it on my bingo card when I started this job that I would become a regulation nerd. So this is just, like, loving it. Anyway, but what I find is that the organisations or the leaders who are open to getting feedback, are open to collaboration, have, I guess, who understand that power and knowledge and influence isn't just attached to your role in an organisation, that all of us in every organisation have expertise, have skills, have knowledge that can influence up and down. And I think when you have organisations that are very good at getting that knowledge from staff, from the people that work there, sharing knowledge and being able to have that learning environment, and also that mistake making and mistake kind of responding to environment that says, we're going to learn from what goes wrong, because that's the best place you learn, and not shy away. We're going to create environments that allow people to question and to raise ways of improving systems. They're the sorts of organisations that will be much better at engaging with children and young people, and engaging with all different groups of people, because there's already an understanding that knowledge and power isn't held in one place, and they recognise that there's an inherent right to be heard and to speak up and have your voice heard, and so they just actively do it. So I think there's an internal culture that needs to be created, because if you just try and do it with one particular group of people, and especially with kids, you're not necessarily getting the values of it. If you're doing it as a, we have to do it because this is what the child safe standards say and we have to do this, you're not getting the value of hearing from children and young people and having their input into this work. So it's not an easy, it's a process, and I think also you want to, there's an idea that I always have in my head about, you've got to build the relationship before the need arises. And I always think about this in terms of lots of children and families that we see that need assistance in their lives dealing with all manner of things. We wait for the crisis to happen and then we want people to respond to it, when what we want is for people, and children and young people in particular, to know there are safe spaces to get help from before the need for the help arises. And so similarly, when I think about when you're engaging with children and young people, you want the relationship with children and young people before you start saying to them, right, tell us how we fix everything. What would you do? What are you going to do? Tell us. Again, applies to any marginalised or silenced group. So it takes time. You've got to build the relationships, and the relationships have to be built on trust and on shared values of what you're going to also give back to the child and young person and the group of children and young people that you're engaging with.
Thanks, Mina, and thank you, Amy, for the question. And just a quick reminder for anyone else in the audience that has a question, please get those into the Q&A as quickly as possible, because time's ticking away. Would you believe it? We've got 10 minutes left, but we might just keep going a little bit longer if people are happy to hang around and our panelists are happy to stay with us, because we haven't really touched on representation and leadership as distinct themes, although they've certainly come into some of the responses. I sense, Natalia.
Yes, I was going to say, before you move on to the next question, I just wanted to add to what Mina just said about safe spaces. And I think in terms of the built environment, spaces for children, we are not very good at creating spaces for children beyond the middle ages, so teenagers, youth, etc. We're very good at creating great toddler playgrounds, but not very good at understanding what that above 10 years sort of will need. Other places around the world are much better at it. They create spaces such as children's hubs, which are run by youth workers, which have those relationships with children. Those spaces where these are really simple spaces. It might be a shipping container type of space in the middle of a park, where these are programs run by youth workers, where children can come every day, and where the youth workers can really build those relationships with children and create those safe spaces for kids. So I think in Australia, we're really, really lacking those physical safe spaces that are specifically designed for children. So they're not just community centres, they are children's centres for kids to be able to engage in safe discussions about all of these things.
Yeah, actually, I think this kind of ties into something that you asked about earlier, about examples of when we don't consult in something that might kind of stand out. A couple of years ago, the Guardian for Children in Canberra did some consultations with young people about their experience of family violence, and they discovered that there was a clash between young people's experience of family violence and a legal policy, a policing policy about moving young people on from public spaces. And young people were saying that one of their tactics, their strategies for when there was danger at home, was to go into public spaces because it was not safe at home. And if they went and they hung out at the mall or they hung out into a public space, then they knew that they would be safe and they could hang out there for a few hours and then they could maybe return home and it might be safe later. But they were having a policing policy of moving young people on from public spaces, not loitering, if you like. But there was no public space. There was no space for them to go to. As Natalia has pointed out, we don't create playgrounds for young people. We create playgrounds for small children and parents. And when young people loiter in playgrounds, they're moved on because they're probably creating a problem, right? And so the challenge that the Guardian uncovered was that we didn't have places for young people to go that were safe for them to stay and place themselves when they were not safe at home. And the police process was to return the young person home. And that was part of the challenge. It was creating a lack of safety, even though the policy was meant to be creating safety for the young person. And I agree, Natalia. I think my research fellowship, when I was researching children's participation approaches overseas, I actually was researching them in organisations and systems, but I was travelling with small children. And something that I noticed, we actually called it, my children at the time were both under 10. We called it our tour of playgrounds, because everywhere we went, and we travelled through Scandinavia and Europe, we were finding, especially in Scandinavia, there was a playground on every corner. Like, these communities were designed so differently to the way ours are. And I was gobsmacked at how differently. It was like it was designed completely with children and families in mind. Everything from the way a subway was designed, the steps down to a subway had a pram ramp every single time so that you could push your pram down to the train station. You know, there was, when you got off the train, there was a tunnel that was decorated for children to go through the exit instead of having to go through the boring walk exit. You know, every single time there were just amazingly thought through child-friendly details. Anyway, I'll let us move to the next topic. But
that's excellent addition there. Thank you, Lauren. I'm going to go to the Q&A because I do want to make sure we get these in. So firstly, Lucia, who is part of a Universal Design Working Group, is wondering about diversity and inclusion in terms of universal design. I'm perhaps a little bit out of my depth with this question. Do any of our panelists understand where this is coming from?
I can start with it. Absolutely. I think one of the things that bothers me the most when we talk about children is we talk about them as if all children are the same. And in fact, the needs of a 0-year-old versus a 14-year-old are wildly different. And then you go further, the needs of a 14-year-old girl versus a 14-year-old boy, once again, wildly different. And then a 14-year-old girl from a migrant community versus not, once again, wildly different. So you can go down and down and down and down. So the need to think about inclusion, and when we're talking about children, what exactly do we mean? In the same way that we talk about inclusive environments, you don't just, you try and consider the widest possible aspect of inclusion, and same goes with children. And then children with special needs also, obviously completely different needs. So I think we need to be a lot more sophisticated when we talk about children's environments, because at the moment it's sort of a one size fits all. You get a plastic playground, you plonk it onto a neighborhood, and there's your child-friendly tick the box sort of exercise done. And no one's thought about, how does a teenage girl engage in this space? How does a child with a disability, with autism, for example, engage in this space, etc., etc. So we just have to be far, far more sophisticated when we're talking about children, because the diversity of children is obviously enormous.
Thanks, Natalia. Lauren, did I sense you wanted to add to that? You don't have to, just checking. No, all good. Because I want to get to Carmen's question. Carmen's from the city of Yarra and is looking for some guidance on how councils and other organisations, for that matter, can facilitate direct involvement of children in the policy-making process related to planning and community outcomes. Thoughts on that, panel?
I might jump in, and I'll just also point people to the Commission's website, and we have a whole range of resources. One in particular that is, where is it? So Child Safe Standard 3 relates to children and young people are empowered about their rights and participate in decision making, and their views are taken seriously. And there's, on our website, we've got different resources available, including an empowerment and participation guide, a guide for organisations working with children and young people. So I think when it comes to policy things, it's the translation. You don't want to get young people and throw some policy at them and go, right, what do you think about this? You've got to translate what it is that and put it into their terms and think about what's the connection between the policy and the practical. And think that policy is one thing that's coming out of practical impact and practical implications. So there is a kind of a translation piece. Just similarly, a lot of adults who don't work in the policy space will be like, what the heck is this stuff? Like, you've got to think, we've got to get out of our comfort zones about this work and be better at meeting children and young people where they are and where they're coming to the conversation at.
I might just throw back at you something you said to me when we were planning this event. You said to me, you need to have people in your organisation who see the inherent value of children and their rights. And I imagine in this space where you're developing policy that's going to have some sort of impact, that's as important as anywhere else.
Absolutely. There's that old adage that children should be seen, not heard. And you have to absolutely believe that kids have a right to be able to speak up about their experiences and what they want in their life, and that they have capacity to show it. And the capacity might not be the capacity as an adult, but it's incumbent upon us as adults to do the work, to give them the space to be able to and have them give capacity, show their views according to their own capacity. And, every single one of us can make some sort of statement about what it is that we want and how things impact us. It's about taking the time to learn how people express themselves and engaging with that. One of the things I find frustrating is and we talk about it a lot I talk about it a lot when I talk about engaging with people with certain lived experiences and certain experiences because of identity or the colour of your skin or whatever it is. And that it's not enough to simply invite people with lived experience, children and young people, to a table and have a conversation with them. We have to be prepared for all the anger, the frustration, the sorrow, the pain that might come with talking, that usually does come with talking with someone who has been through something traumatic or difficult, or has been marginalised, or has always been silenced. We can't be I don't know, what's the word? We can't be precious about, they might use swear words, or, they might, cry, or they might, get emotional, or things like that. We have to absolutely accept those as valid responses to situations and the experiences that lots of people may have had. Similarly with children and young people, if this first time you're speaking to, if it's the first time, expect the full range of emotions and gamut and everything, and, we have to kind of remove that professionalism hat that sometimes sometimes dulls us down. We have to meet kids in their fullness of excitement and energy and emotion and all of it.
So we are out of time, but if I can just hold people back for a little bit, I just want to try and bring this into land somehow. We've covered so much today, but in terms of the journey, I guess, for people in council land to support organisational change that amplifies children's voice, what sort of advice, and I might come to you first, Lauren, would you give to people about how to start on that journey?
I think the first thing I'd say is to remember that participation is a right. So if you start with your expectation that this isn't something a kindness, that will help. It helps with what Mina's just referred to too. You won't be disappointed if a child gets annoyed or upset or grumpy, because you're not going to be thinking, why are they annoyed? I've given them this great opportunity. You'll think, well, that's a reasonable response because it's their right and they've got an opportunity and they're allowed to express emotion. So if you start with that thing, this is their right and it's my job, my duty to facilitate a space for them to participate. So I think start with that. It's their right it's my duty. I need to have a think about how to facilitate that. That's really important. And I think the other thing is to think about, because it's their right, part of what you're doing is actually thinking about how do I honour and develop their capacity as citizens. That's really what participation is about. Children's rights to participate is about honouring and developing their capacity as citizens. We're helping create citizens, and that's what children are. So yeah, thinking about that. And the other thing I would say is children can be both vulnerable and capable at the same time, and try to avoid the idea that they have to be one or the other. Because if we go for one or the other, we often end up limiting. And I think that's a problem in lots of vulnerable groups, lots of marginalised groups. We tend to focus on one or the other. And if we focus on one or the other, we lose nuance. And the world is nuanced. Humans are nuanced. I think that that's true in lots of current topical areas. So I think if you can think about people being vulnerable and capable at the same time, that will help you in your participation space.
Excellent. Thank you, Lauren. Natalia, any thoughts from you?
Really just to echo what's already been said in terms of making sure if you're going to set out on this process, make sure that it's genuine. So make sure that the end outcome and the end goal is to actually make a difference and to have change, rather than just doing it for the sake of looking good because you've got some photos of engaging with kids. So do it in a genuine way and try and engage with the most diverse possible range of children and caregivers that you can possibly find. And often that means engaging in different ways, such as using technology, using apps, going to schools, to childcare centres, etc. So making sure that you really capture the diversity of what children actually means.
Some stuff in there that I think strikes home. And Mina, any final thoughts from you on how we can be better prepared for this journey?
I'm going to cheat a little bit and refer people to our guide to participation and empowerment. And there's a specific page on there, page 15, that talks about supporting empowerment in organisations, and it just reinforces those things about you've got to model the behaviours in your own, you've got to see it modelled in your own organisations before you can take it out to different groups of people. And also when you're talking, as Natalia was saying earlier, children and young people are not a homogenous group. There is so much diversity within children and young people, and recognising that if you are engaging with children and young people who are also from backgrounds that have been in communities that have been marginalised, be prepared to do the hard work and be prepared to engage and understand where some anger might be coming from when you're engaging with those children and young people, because if I think about Aboriginal children and young people and the week that we've just had, Aboriginal children and young people are doubly voiceless in terms of simply being children. They're not supposed to talk. Being Aboriginal children and young people, especially after the referendum outcomes, we're actively saying to them, your voice doesn't matter. So you really need to make sure that with those particular communities, you're working hard. But you really need to find the champions in your organisation. Find the people who do this well, and you'll know them. And they might not be in the roles that are directly engaging with children and young people or doing that specific work, but find them, and you will know the people who just have great ways of engaging and utilise people's talents that might not necessarily come directly from those roles.
Thank you, Mina. I noticed someone found the reaction button. There were little hearts flying up as you were speaking there, which I'm taking as a vote of support for what you were saying. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. We've gone a little over, so thank you to our panelists and to our audience for your patience. I know some of them have had to leave us, which is fair enough, given it's lunchtime webinar. If you'd like to know more about the topics discussed today and how you can be involved, you can become a charter signatory by accessing the guide, emailing the VLGA, and advise your organisation to endorse the charter, and the VLGA will then register your charter endorsement and add you to the CFCC network, and you'll get a signatory certificate as a result of that process. You can attend a meeting of the network to hear what it's all about. You can join an advisory group. You can express interest there and collaborate with like-minded colleagues to progress the charter across Victoria. If you would like someone to provide you with some more information on the topics today, please drop a note now into the Q&A, and the VLGA team will make sure that they reach out to you to discuss that further. Amy Carson is with us, Carmen Capello as well. Thank you both for not only being here, but for being available to provide more information to people. And there are the contact details for Amy at Merribic and Carmen at Yarra on your screen. Now, we had a lot of people register for the event that didn't actually turn up live, and that's okay, because what happens is those people are going to be hanging out for the recording of the webinar today. It will come out in the next few days. It takes a little while to get the program edited and ready for publishing to the VLGA's YouTube channel, but keep an eye on that, and I suspect the VLGA will probably send a note out to all registered attendees to let you know that it is available. I want to thank once more our terrific panelists today. Meena Singh, thank you. Natalia Krishak, thank you. And Lauren Thomas, thank you very much for being so generous with your time and your insights in today's discussion. Thank you to you, the audience, for being part of our lunchtime webinar this Children's Week. I hope you found it useful, and we hope to see you at another VLGA event very soon. Bye for now.